My name is Laura. An addiction advocate is the best way that I found to describe it. And I'm doing this podcast, this whole thing, in hopes of creating a platform or a space where we can discuss addiction, mental health, kind of discuss where it comes from, what causes it, the brain pathways, the genetic links, as well as the many ways of recovery, societal implications, generational trauma, just kind of all the things that go into it, as well as family support. So, how does family support or loved ones support a person, and how do we support the loved ones when they're going through these? I also wanted to provide an opportunity for those who have lost someone to this disease to share their stories, share their understanding of this person's personality, their quirks, the good, the bad, just all of the things that kind of get lost when when that label of an addict kind of comes in. Um, I also want those who are in recovery, who have suffered from this disease, who maybe are currently still struggling with it, to share their story. What worked, what didn't, what pushed it along, what started it, what stopped it, what helped, just all of these things. So, with all that being said, today we're going to talk about literally the connection between trauma and addiction. And with that comes the fact that we're going to be talking about a lot of things that could be triggering. So I usually give a bit of a trigger warning, and it's a lot. There's a lot of triggers. We're going to talk about a lot of triggers. It's trauma. So how it's trauma. So I think trigger warning would just be just trigger warning. All the things, right? I'm not going to go super in depth with these things, but it is helpful to be aware of. So, that being said, let's kind of just jump into, let's get the basics, right? So, why? Why am I talking about trauma? So, as I'm starting to record some of these stories, trauma keeps coming up, right? So, I want to kind of touch on why trauma is such a big thing. One study I found said the comorbidity rate between trauma and addiction was upwards of 46%. Uh, Most of them described it between 26 and 52. So at that point, you're looking at anywhere from a fourth to half of those with addiction have a trauma diagnosis as well. And words, comorbidity. It's a really funky word that we use, and it basically just means when two diagnoses tend to kind of come together, right? Or they are together often. One way we can describe this is with, like, I have a diagnosis of ADHD, and very, very often anxiety comes along with it. And it's the tendency for one diagnosis, it's the tendency for two diagnoses or two or more diagnoses to be bound together. They just tend to kind of like run in groups, right? They run in pairs, they run in groups, and a lot of it's because the symptoms are similar, or because one kind of has a correlation to the other, or there's the symptoms of one might bring on the likelihood of another. Uh, Anxiety comes on with ADHD just because of all of the stress that we're under to try and keep track of everything, and our brain's like just all over the place and in 17 different tracks. And so anxiety is just going to kind of come along with it. So that comorbidity rate for addiction and trauma, like I said, can be anywhere from like a fourth to half the people you're running into that have addiction issues have trauma issues. That's a lot, right? Like, to be aware of that, that's a lot. And I would say that most of the people that I work with have trauma. I've laughed because I've gone to interviews for jobs, and they're like, well, what's your experience working with people with trauma? And I always laugh because I'm like, I don't think I've ever worked with somebody that doesn't have trauma, because there's trauma everywhere. Uh, it just is. Everybody's trauma is different, and everybody deals with it differently, but everybody has some form of trauma. It's just a matter of how big is it, how often is it, how complex is it, and has it caused enough of a upset in your life to be a problem, right? Um, but most often we end up diagnosing one and finding the other, right? So a lot of times in maybe private practice, or maybe if someone's coming in suicidal ideation, things like that, you might diagnose PTSD or post traumatic stress disorder and then find out there's an underlying addiction, or not necessarily underlying, but there's a addiction problem along with it, right? All of a sudden you're like, hey, you're drinking a lot. That's interesting. How much are you drinking? You start asking those questions and you're like, interesting. That's helpful information. Um, or the other way around is maybe they're coming in for treatment and they're coming in for treatment at an actual substance use treatment center. You originally diagnose the substance use issue, and then as you're kind of going along, you're realizing there's a lot of trauma here, and you start then diagnosing the trauma. But more often than not, you're going to find an underlying issue there. So, with kind of that base layer in place, what is trauma, right? Trauma is an emotional response to a stressful or terrible event. And there's no really, like I said, there's no really underlying what constitutes trauma. It is just, did it cause an emotional response within you enough to upset your homeostatic situation within your body and your mind, right? Did it make you fear for your life, your family, your future, any of those things? If it made you fear for those things enough, right? This can happen to ourselves. This can happen to people we care about. It can be seen or witnessed. It can be heard about, right? Those of us who lived through 9/11, there were a lot of people that weren't anywhere near New York, but saw it on TV enough. Another one that a lot of mental health professionals deal with, or um, even parents, things like that, is secondary trauma. So that's the trauma that comes from learning about, understanding, or working through other people's trauma. So if mental health professionals are sitting there listening to other people's trauma all day long, they're going to start to take that in. They're going to take in those emotions. They're going to take in those feelings, and they're trying to process it for the other person. And eventually it does have an effect. Another way this can happen is for parents, like if their child experienced some kind of abuse, sexual assault, something like that, they can have their own secondary trauma for that because they're trying to help their child, they're trying to get them through it, and it didn't directly happen to them, but it's a situation in which they are trying to then help somebody else through it, and hearing about it, dealing with it, the effects of it can have an effect on them. So secondary trauma is also a thing. And there's a couple different forms of this. So there's the kind of acute that we get when it's just after something happens and we have that emotional response, things happen, we're stressed, we're upset, we're trying to deal with it, we're trying to get through it, right? And if that doesn't happen, if that doesn't last more than about 6 months, generally we're able to kind of move forward. We're able to process it, move on, kind of work through it, and we move on. The other one we've got is PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder, which again is post trauma, right? So we are dealing with these emotions and we're having these stressful responses to it post trauma. And it's usually, this can last, once it lasts past about 6 months, this is when we get more into that PTSD situation where we're constantly feeling the responses to this. The other one that we see a lot is the CPTSD. And I don't believe this is actually in the DSM. I want to say that it isn't. I'm probably wrong. But because I've memorized my own diagnoses that I work with so often that I don't go back to it as much as I should. But it's one of those things that like I only go back to it when I'm like, I'm not sure if I need that. So like, but the the CPTSD is complex stress disorder. So this generally comes in when we have dealt with a lot of trauma and it's been ongoing and consistent. So this happens a lot with children who experience abuse throughout their childhood, right? So if we're experiencing one big trauma, right, like we're having a really great childhood, things are going good, our parents are super loving and supportive, but then they get divorced, right? That's a trauma. That's stressful. Like it's an upset in our lives, it's an upset in our routine. It's stressful. It can be confusing for our futures. We don't know what's going on. We don't know how to deal with it. Right? So at that point, we're experiencing a trauma. but it's a one-time situation. If our parents continue to be supportive and caring, maybe get us family therapy if we need it or individual therapy, if both parents continue to be in our lives and are right there with us, kind of get us through it, then this is a one-time trauma, right? This is one of those situations where we're able to work through it and understand how the world works. And we might still have some abandonment issues. We might still get upset when divorces happen, right? But we're able to kind of like work through it. Versus if our entire childhood has been abuse, neglect, trauma, right? If we are consistently getting beat on, if we are consistently not able to get the food, the clothing, the love, the support that we need, at that point, it's trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. And at that point, it becomes more complex, right? Because then it's not just one simple trauma that we're trying to work through. We're working through multiple traumas and we're working through multiple years, multiple levels. We're not just working through 6-year-old child with maybe a divorce issue and we're working through some abandonment here. At that point, we're working through 3-year-old neglected child and 6-year-old abused child, an 11-year-old abandoned child. And right, we're working through all of that and it causes significant complexity. As I said in, I think it was episode 3, I did the anonymous post and we talked about how development has an effect. That also comes into play. So at that point, we're not just dealing with basics of we were neglected, we were abused. We're dealing with the development that didn't work correctly. We're dealing with attachment that didn't happen the way that it was supposed to. And so it's just so much more complex, and there's so many more levels to it, right? Um, Another term that we tend to use is little t versus big T traumas. So big T traumas are those big situations that happen, right? So um, we're going along our normal lives, things are working, we're doing our things, right? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, our best friend dies, right? Like that's a huge trauma. Like that's big, that's huge, that's hard, that's impossible. We're just struggling. We're just like, oh my god, I just lost my best friend. Like it's hard, right? It's really hard. That's going to be a big trauma. So these are generally big things that cause a huge change in our lives. We're going along, we're doing our thing, and all of a sudden, um, we lose our job. That creates a cascade effect. We're now losing our house, and we're having to figure this out. We're having to figure that out. Right, the big T trauma. Something happens, and it's this big, massive change, or this big, massive upset in our lives. Right. So it's like that big wave that comes in. You're sailing along just fine in your little boat, and all of a sudden this big wave comes along, and it knocks everything over. Right, and then you gotta work on get the boat flipped back over and get yourself and everything else back in the water. Not in the water, in the boat. You want to get back in the boat, right? You're working on getting everything back in the freaking boat, right? Now, little t traumas are those situations where things are constantly happening that are just traumatic enough to make things difficult, right? So we're sailing along in our little boat and we're doing the things, and all of a sudden we hit a stick or a rock, and it causes a tiny little hole, just a tiny little one in our boat, right? And we patch it. We're like, oh, real quick, we get a little bit of water in, but we're like, okay, we can do this. We patch the hole, and then we're going along, and we hit another rock. Here's another hole. It's on the other side of the boat. We go in, and we get more water, and we're like, patching up. Okay, we're good. We got this. We're okay. We got this, right? Then we're going along. We hit another rock. There's another freaking hole, right? And we just keep doing this, but over time, those little tiny holes that we've continued to patch break down the stability of the boat. And so at some point, one of those little tiny holes is going to cause the entire boat to break down because it can only hold up so many little tiny holes with so many patches because it just doesn't have the stability it did before, right? So that's the difference between big T's, where it's like this huge thing happened and I'm able to kind of flip things over and I'm able to get back to normal, right? Or hopefully some. Versus these little traumas that constantly just attack our psyche and attack our ability to just keep going in life. And we do our best to patch it up and move on and work our way through it. And then it happens again and it happens again and it happens again. And no matter how many times we patch up those holes, we just feel like we're constantly patching. and we're just trying so hard to just keep the water from coming in, and at some point the boat sinks. So, and those little T traumas generally come in the form of, like I said, um, where mom loses her job again, right? We're working our way through life as a kid, and mom loses her job because she's using again, right? And we're like, oh shit, what are we gonna do? And you eat the top ramen for a couple of weeks, mom gets her job again, and then a couple of weeks later, mom does it again, and then a few weeks later, mom does it again, right? And we're like, oh shit, okay, and then we do it again, and then we do it again, and then we do it again, right? And so at some point, these what would be a big T trauma to most people have become a little T trauma to you because you're like, nah, okay, we've done this, I can do this again, but at some point, mom losing her job for like the 10th, 15th, 20th, 30th time because she's using, just like, I cannot do this again. So the signs and symptoms of trauma, right? It's a long list. So we've got insomnia, which means struggling to sleep, which also comes along with extreme fatigue, easily startled. So those are the people that like you walk up behind them and you say hello when they jump, right? They're scared. They're consistently anxious. So that's another thing that comes along with this, often anxiety, trouble focusing, a lot of nightmares. These can be nightmares that are connected to the trauma or seemingly completely unconnected. Rapid heartbeat, agitation, so they just seem constantly on edge. They're really easily angered, right? Um, Body aches, um, muscle tension, denial, right? Where there's like, that never happened. I'm not dealing with it. That didn't happen. Anger, mood swings. So they can go from like super, super happy to super, super sad. And they can be all of a sudden angry out of nowhere, right? Confusion. They can kind of lose track of what's going on. A lot of guilt, shame, blaming yourself, right? So a lot of times the best way to find control is to put it on ourselves. So it's kind of like, oh, if I wasn't walking in that neighborhood, it wouldn't have happened. Well, if I had done this differently, dad wouldn't have hit me, right? We take the blame on ourselves because it's easier than blaming the other person because sometimes we can't control others. Well, we never can control other people's behaviors. So, but we can control our own, right? And so we take the blame on disbelief a lot of times happens, or shock, withdrawal. So it's where we isolate people away from people, feelings of hopelessness. This can happen a lot, or feelings of being disconnected or numb. So just a whole host of different things that can feel right. And these can be anywhere from physical symptoms to emotional, behavioral symptoms, right? And so it's just a whole host of things that we tend to look for. Um, and again, kind of the types. So we've got abuse, right? And this can be physical, emotional, sexual, financial, mental, right? Um, when I say financial, this is one that I talk about a lot with my domestic violence groups. It's where someone controls all of the finances, doesn't allow you to have any, um, or makes you work like 5 or 6 jobs while they sit at home with all the money. Other types of domestic violence is one, religious trauma. A lot of people are coming away from different religions, not just one or the other, but a lot of religions with religious trauma. Illness, so whether that's a chronic illness, cancer, um, a scare, any of those can be considered trauma. An accident, so car accident, falling off a roof, those can all be traumas. An assault, um, physical or sexual assault, um, bullying, neglect, natural disasters, terrorism, said 9/11, war. Um, so some of these other countries that are dealing with a lot of war right now, unfortunately, they're going to have a lot of trauma. Death. So anytime you experience a death of a loved one, death of a pet, anything like that. And the other one that we might deal with a lot for first responders is the trauma of seeing or witnessing or walking into these situations of any of these, right? So if we've got a police officer that's walking into a domestic violence situation and sees something happen, that could be trauma. EMTs that are walking into horrible car accidents, that are walking into children dying, things like that, that's trauma, right? These are all things that build up. So Those are kind of the basics, right? So, and again, I talked about this a little bit in episode 1 when I was talking about my sister. But the effects on the brain is part of what causes us to look for joy, happiness, anything to give us something, right? So when we have a lot of trauma, right, it causes a buildup of those toxic stress hormones in our brain. And as there's higher levels, and as we continue to get higher levels, right, because we experience trauma, we're stressed out, we're dealing with it, so trauma causes our fight or flight response. Trauma causes our fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, right? So we go into must protect, must save, must live survival mode, right? And so our body releases those hormones that are required for us to survive. So that's cortisol, things like that, right? It's like gotta survive, gotta live, gotta make it through this. So our body releases those hormones and get us going, right? And the idea is that eventually those hormones are supposed to go back down. Really, the trauma is only supposed to, that response is only supposed to last for a very short period of time, long enough to deal with the problem in front of us. But if we're dealing with trauma, where it's something that has affected our actual mental health, where it's affected our ability to see the world, our concept of what we know in our lives, that problem is not just a snarling saber-toothed tiger in the corner that's easier to deal with, right? There's a saber-toothed tiger in the corner. The simplicity is fight the tiger, survive, and get out, right? As soon as the saber-toothed tiger is gone, we're good, right? We can move on. It's over, like we're tiger's gone, right? But if we've had a car accident, then every time we get in that car, it's no longer like that car's gone. The car is there, right? We have to get in the car to drive to work. But that trauma is going to be reenacted every time we get in that car. There's always going to be that concern. Oh shit, what happens if this car crashes, right? If there's randomly a saber-toothed tiger in the corner of our living room, the chances of a saber-toothed tiger being in the corner of our living room are pretty unlikely, right? It's not going to happen again. But the chances of us getting a car accident, our brains are like likelihood pretty high, right? Logic doesn't play a whole lot of play in here, right? Logic doesn't come into play very well here. So we continue. So every time we get in that car, our fight or flight response kicks in, and we're just like, I'm up, I'm hyper aware, I'm being vigilant, I'm paying attention, making sure that car's not going to hit me, I'm making sure that car's over there, I'm making sure that, right, you are paying attention, right, which ups those cortisol levels. And the idea is that originally the cortisol levels are supposed to go back down, or our dopamine levels are supposed to rise to meet it, right, and that we'll get back to a homeostatic state. However, oftentimes, if our trauma keeps building up, we don't get back to that homeostatic state. Our cortisol levels are staying up here at 300, and there is no calming it down. And so if it continues to stay up here, our chances of feeling joy, happiness, love, those things are pretty slim, because all that we're feeling right now is that cortisol. All we're feeling right now is that stress. And so at that point, it makes it harder and harder for us to also get out of that fight or flight, because then we're hyper vigilant, right? So we're looking for anything that could possibly be a source of attack. And so we then pick up on things more and more, right? So then anytime a car maybe is driving a little bit fast, we're like, ugh, right? Like, it's good, it's going to hit me, even though it's probably not, right? We're thinking it's going to hit us because it's right? Like, at that point, we're thinking it's going to, which then raises our cortisol levels higher again. And it's just this constant cycle. So at that point, our body is constantly responding to stress at a higher level than it would have before. And it's also going to respond to more things that wouldn't have been stressful before, right? So if we're already at a level 10, when normally we were sitting at a level 5 in terms of stress levels, the dishes not being done are now like through the roof stressful, right? When before it was like, okay, dishes, whatever, we're fine, we can live with this, right? Now all of a sudden, dishes not being done, it's the end of the world, right? We respond to everything at a level 10 when before we were responding at a level 4 or 5. Everything is a level 10 now, right? And we're going to continue continue to do that, which again raises those cortisol levels, which consistently puts us in a cycle. At some point, if we are consistently in this trauma cycle, then we are going to want to find a way to feel good. We're going to want to find a way to either feel good or feel numb or not feel anything at all, whatever that is. We're going to want to be like, I want out of this. This sucks. I hate it. Please fix it. And a lot of times, if we're not looking, if we're not in a place to be able to fix it or work through it or find the way to just deal with it, right? At that point, we're going to look for a quick fix, which generally means something that's going to give us a dopamine surge. That's where addiction comes in, right? As I described before, most often, any addiction, whether substance or behavioral, gives us a really awesome dopamine surge, right? Like I said in episode 2 with the gumballs, right? We're sitting there, we're going along at these cortisol levels that are hitting a 300, and we're just dying. Just like, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this. And we see a gumball machine, and you're like, fuck it. I'm gonna get a damn gumball just because I need something, right? You get a gumball, and all of a sudden 2 gumballs come out. You're like, hallelujah, I got the gumballs. Life is awesome. I'm feeling good today, right? Like everything is good. And you're like, all of a sudden you're like, how? And also it hits and you're like, holy crap, I felt good. I felt normal. Or I felt numb. I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel stressed today. Holy crap, that was amazing. And the next thing you're going to do, you're going to go back and you're trying for 2 gumballs again, because God knows at that point, you're like, holy shit, I will do anything to feel nothing or feel happy or feel something that isn't stress, right? You're going to do whatever the hell it takes to get to that point. And sometimes we do this by mistake because we go out, to a party with friends, and all of a sudden we're drinking a few margaritas, and we're just like, damn, I feel good, right? Like I feel really good. Like I feel kind of numb. I'm like, holy crap, feeling good. The Matthew Perry episode I did just last one, he's talking about, he's like, I tried drinking, and all of a sudden I was like, I am on cloud 9. What is happening? It feels good, right? Or he talks about how he tried Vicodin, and the next day he's like, it felt like warm honey running through my veins. He wasn't seeking out opiates, but he got it because of an accident, and all of a sudden it's like, holy shit, I feel good. I feel good. I feel normal. I feel like a person. What the hell? And now you're like, okay, I want to feel that again, because this other option sucks, and I don't want to feel that option again. I want to feel this one. So you're going to do whatever it takes to feel that one, even if it means giving up all the things, right? We kind of talked about the disease now, but you're going to do whatever it takes, right? And you're going to break that hyperarousal state you're consistently in all of the time, right? So the other thing I want to talk about, where we get into the, like I said, there's a lot of things that happen, right? So this can either happen accidentally or purposefully. But one of the things that kind of predisposes us to this is if we see other people doing it, right? So if we're going along as a kid and we're suffering from a lot of trauma, we're dealing with a lot of things, and we notice dad comes home from a bad day at work and drinks 6 beers, and we're like, and he's feeling better. We're like, oh, okay, that seemed to help him feel better. Okay, we start to make that connection in our head, whether we're conscious of it or not. We make that connection, right? The other thing that can come into play is if we're around friends or neighborhood or whatever that tends to use, right? So we're like, oh, I'm seeing this happen. This seems to work. I love this, right? So there's a lot of things that kind of predispose us for using addiction, and a lot of that is societal, right? If older brother used cocaine and it seemed to make him feel better, we're like, interesting. I wonder if this will make me feel better. So we're doing everything we can to feel any kind of something in a way to make ourselves get to a point. And we notice other people doing this. We're like, oh, interesting. That worked for them. I'm going to try it too. The other thing that predisposes it, and this kind of gets back into what trauma is, but there's something called the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. So this is something that most mental health professionals, if not all, do to understand trauma, right? And so we'll usually do this at an intake that works through any trauma experiences in childhood that might have an effect on you. I won't go through all of them, but I'll link a resource that you can read a little bit more about this ACEs study, as well as go in and do it if you're curious, right? I think mine comes up at like an 8 or a 9 out of a 10, so that gives you a good hint as to my childhood. But it generally goes into did you have any kind of violence or abuse in the home? Like, were you abused, witness abuse? Did you grow up with family members who struggled with mental health or substance use? Did you grow up with family members that were in the system? Right? They go to prison, the trauma. So, any of these things, did you ever feel unloved or uncared for? Any of these things that could have an effect, so that complex trauma later on in life, right? So they've done many, many studies on this since they kind of figured it out. And they've linked it to an earlier onset of drinking, right? So if you're 12 and your life sucks and your friend hands you a bottle of tequila and you're like, fuck it, let's try it, right? It also leads to, interestingly enough, later in life development of substance use. So post 50 years old, right? So you might find a way to survive through childhood. You might find a way to survive through your middle adult years where you're a parent and an employee and all of these things and you're making it through. But then you hit this point, like I said, with enough of those little T traumas that have caused it, and you've managed to keep your boat functioning. And then you get to a point where you're no longer having a lot of people rely upon you, maybe. And all of a sudden you're just kind of like, the boat's sinking. Interesting. And you just let it sink. And the next thing you know, you're drinking every night, right? It's just it's one of those things where all of a sudden you're just like, meh, I'll let the boat sink. See what happens. Right? I just don't have the energy anymore. So that happens. An increase in smoking because it's an addiction. I don't care what you say. It's an addiction. It's not one that I care much about half the time. If you're not using cocaine, I will take nicotine. I don't give a shit. But it is one, right? Because it makes you feel better. And I don't know if most people realize this, but it works as a deep breathing technique because you're taking a deep breath and we're letting out a deep breath. Just so you know. I'm not proposing starting smoking, but if you take the breathing that you're using with the smoking and maybe take it a little bit, it actually works really well. Prescription drug use increased by 62%. My sister. Yeah, right. And a lot of those, again, can be an accident, right? She got in a car accident. They gave her the pills and all. She's like, shit, I feel good. I like this. This works even better than than the alcohol. We're going to go with that. We're going to go with that. We're going to do that. Right? Each ACE number increases the likelihood of illicit drug use by 2 to 4. Not by 2 to 4%, but like it either doubles or quadruples it. So, like I said, it's between a 1 and a 10. There's 10 questions, and however many mark offs that get. So if you get a 1, then it doubles it, right? If you get a 4, then it can increase that likelihood of illicit drug use. Because at that point, again, we're also going to develop a tolerance to these things, right? So we're going to try alcohol. We're going to be like, it kind of worked, but it didn't really get me where I wanted to go. Or it works, and it works for 4 or 5 years, and then all of a sudden it's like, it's not really doing the thing anymore. So I'm gonna do the other thing, right? And I'm gonna try something else. And so then we try maybe prescription drug use, and that works for a little while, and then that one kind of stops working, and the cortisol level kind of starts breaking through, right? And the gumballs are now becoming 0 gumballs instead of 2, and we're like, cool. Now what do I try? So then we go for the harder drugs. We start going for opiates. We start going for heroin and cocaine and whatever, because it's like, well, that wasn't working. Let's try something stronger. And then we start using more of those things, right? It tends to cause this buildup of those cortisol levels are so high because, again, each ACE adds on another complexity to it, right? Maybe you have an ACE of abuse, and then you have one of neglect, and then you have one of dad in prison, right? These are complexities. And so now you're trying to hide behind a lot of things, right? And so we're building up a tolerance, and it's like, this isn't quite doing it anymore. I'm gonna add on, and so we just put that down. Also with the ACEs, it indicates that we tend to have less protective factors. Again, protective factors for trauma, right? So if we're one of those people, like I was describing in the beginning, where we went through life and everything was going good, and all of a sudden, mom and dad get divorced, but mom and dad were there the whole time. So we developed attachment. We love our parents. Our parents are supportive. We know they're there. We know they're going to care for us and love us and support us and take us through these things, right? Those are protective factors. We know that we have a good, safe home base. We have safety in our home. We have stability in our home. We know people love us. We know we're cared for. We've never experienced neglect or abuse. Those kinds of things. They provide us with protective factors and the ability to be resilient, right? Or we make it all the way through childhood and there's no trauma, right? And then we get into adulthood and maybe we do lose our mom, which is an entirely huge trauma, right? But we still have dad. Dad's been amazing and wonderful and great. We have these great memories of mom, and we've always been able to kind of make it through our lives. We have the ability to be resilient through that. It will be terrible and it will be incredibly difficult, but we can do it because we have these resiliency. We haven't experienced developmental upset. We haven't experienced attachment issues. We haven't experienced what it feels like to never know if we're going to eat tomorrow, or to have dad beat the crap out of us every time he comes home from work, right? We don't know what those things feel like. We just know love and support and care and all of those things. And so all of a sudden, this great pain comes in, but we have these things to kind of like wrap around us like a great big blanket that's just kind of like, okay, I'm going to hide in this blanket for a little bit, but I can get out of it, right? Those of us that maybe didn't have those things don't have that blanket wrapped around us. So with those lack of protective factors, we might not know what it feels like to know good meals. We might not know what it feels like to be loved. We might not know what it feels like to have all these things. And so we're likely to go to things that would give us that some kind of a base. And I've even had clients say the best relationship they've ever had has been with a drug. It hasn't been with their family because it at least stuck around. You also have less coping skills, right? If you've never learned how to cope, right? If mom never sat down and had a conversation with you, what's your feelings and how do you feel about that? What's going on, right? I don't know what that looks like. If we never figured out how to deep breathe or take some time to ourselves or read a book because that's how we cope with that. When shit hits the fan, we don't know what to do. At that point, we're just looking for something, right? We have an earlier onset of mental health issues. Again, where a lot of these kids are going into, again, PTSD, depression, anxiety, all of these things earlier on. Like, we're hitting like, you can have kids that have these issues as early as, early childhood, right? I've seen kiddos as young as 3 have suicidal ideation because they're like, I know that no one loves me. So you have less support. You have less people around you to take care of you. Again, you're learning non-healthy ways, right? Like if everybody around you is using substances, you're like, oh, cool, that works, right? If everybody around you is doing behavioral shit, if they're, screaming and yelling, then that's how you know how to handle. You start looking earlier for ways to feel better, right? You maybe as a regular child, you're going out and doing sports and riding your bike and doing all the things you want to do. But if that's not happening and you're just looking for ways to feel better, like I described again in my sister's episode, we were looking like we were doing the bike riding, but we weren't doing normal bike riding, right? Like we were doing like, let's ride our bikes off the freaking roof. Because at that point, it's not about let's go out and just be normal kids. It was about let me just feel something that's not stress and pain and anger. I just want to feel just happy somehow anywhere in this. Let me feel it, right? And again, we're going to feel that developmental stuff. So something else to keep in mind with this is that it can create a bit of a cycle, right? So if we have trauma and then we use substances or we have an addiction, we can then create additional trauma due to these addictions. So let's say we're using drugs to the point that we're not paying our bills and then we end up losing our home or our apartment or whatever, then we're experiencing homelessness. And homelessness comes with extreme amount of trauma, right? So we then experience whatever trauma comes with that. Then we end up using more to deal with trauma that we're under while we're homeless. That's kind of how that cycle creates. Or maybe we have a good life, things are going well, we're doing the right thing, right? And then for some reason, because genetics do play a part, right, we end up using substances, or we end up with these behavioral addictions, whether that's gambling or whatever. Um, and we end up with charges, whether that be due to distribution or having it in place, or because we're then doing theft, whatever, right? Um, and then we end up with they end up going to jail or prison, and that creates its own form of trauma. So we've got all of these other things. So a list of good options, a good list of things that can come with that are, like I said, homelessness, loss, including job, home, family, friends, relationships, right? Assaults. Um, these can come in with substance use, whether that's you doing them or somebody else, right? Um, Prison or jail, witnessing assaults, sexual promiscuity. I hate that word, but fortunately, a lot of ways that we end up then getting our drugs is by selling our bodies. That does happen, and that is absolutely a trauma. Witnessing death, for witnessing overdoses, things like that. Uh, Witnessing murder, things like that can come along with it. Court is a trauma. Sometimes treatment and maybe ending up in a psych ward or something like that can be a treatment. Acting out ourselves, right? So like I said, when we're in the middle of our use, we're not the same person we are when we're not, and then we come out of it and we realize the things that we've done and said. That creates its own kind of trauma because it's an attack against ourselves, our values, who we are. That creates its own problem. But when I was dealing with my sister, um, there was a situation where she was about to give birth to her second. Um, and the horrible things she said that night, I never shared those with her, but she did eventually find out some of the things that she said and did that night to me. Um, it caused her a lot of pain to hear that, right? Because she's like, I can't believe I said those things to you. I'm so sorry. I never really held a grudge against her for that, but she held more guilt than anybody else did about that. The change in yourself, right? So we can have a change in our belief about the world, understanding about the world. All of a sudden, we went from not understanding these things are possible to all of a sudden these things are absolutely possible and this is what's happening. The physical pain, right? We can have physical ailments coming from the substance use, which creates its own physical pain, or loss of teeth. I have a lot of clients who suffer from some serious self-consciousness issues and trauma because of the loss of their teeth, um, loss of limbs, things like that, right? Again, then we end up with additional traumas on top of, and then we go and use more to avoid these traumas, right? It's like, I don't want to think about all of these other things, and we end up then using more to avoid them. Something that a lot of people don't talk about a lot um, is the trauma of the perpetrator, that term, or the person who caused pain to other people, right? So those are the people that are like, when they're in the height of their addiction, they're being drug dealers, they might be part of a gang, they're inmates in prison, things like that, right? And they might act out physically or assault others, um, do things they never would do normally in the height of their addiction to keep their addiction going. And throughout my time as a therapist, one of the things that I have seen so often is the trauma that causes to that person. Um, they have to deal with knowing the pain that they have caused another person, right? So if you're talking about somebody who had a DUI, and they drove drunk and they killed somebody, right? Like, I don't ever want to take away from the trauma of that family that lost somebody. That's incredibly huge. However, that person who caused that pain and that death, that is a trauma for them too. That is an incredibly deep wound for them to realize that their addiction brought on this death, brought on this pain for somebody else, brought on damage to another person. especially if there's somebody that maybe is normally a calm, sweet person with, all the values and morals or whatever. And they're all of a sudden like, I did this thing. I caused this pain to somebody else. I can't believe I did that. That's completely against who I am. That is a trauma. Um, and it's just like if a police officer goes out and they actually have to kill somebody, right? Like, granted, it might have been in defense of somebody else, but they still killed someone. They still caused somebody to lose their life. That is a trauma, right? Um, right. We look at one as justifiable when another one isn't, and I understand the difference there, and most of us do. But when we're in survival mode, our brain doesn't see it that way. Our brain just sees it as this is what's going to help me survive. And if I have to do this, if I have to beat somebody up to get my drugs, if I have to commit crime to get what I need, this might not be justifiable in the end. At this point, it's just justifiable to me in this moment because I'm going to get the means to an end. I'm going to get that survival. That's something that I, as a mental health professional, have noticed quite a bit, and it's a shame that's also associated with that because, like, I know that I experienced this trauma, but I can't really talk about it because it's not really seen as a trauma, but it is. So, all that being said, right? It's a cycle. They come very often together, and when we aren't taught the correct skills, we go to the ones that we know and understand, which is oftentimes something that's a quick and easy fix. And our brain does this because our brain wants something that's going to make us feel better, right? And if it's something, once our brain creates a pathway that's like, this works, I know this works, it's going to continue to go back there. Back there. Yeah. It's going to continue to go back there because it knows that it works. And it's a quick fix. A lot of people are like, millennials, these younger generations, they like quick fixes. It's not just the younger generations, it's in general. We like quick fixes. We like things that are going to make life easier in a super fast way because our brain goes there. Our brain likes fast. Our brain likes easy. It's why TV dinners were huge in the 50s and 60s. It's why we like having quick news snippets. It's why we like having fast food diners. And those didn't come out in the last 20 years. Those have been around for a long time, right? Like, our brain likes things that are easier fixes. And if a substance or behavior is going to give us that easy fix, it's going to go there, right? And once a pathway is built, our brain knows that that's going to work and it's going to keep going back there. And if creating a healthy coping skill is going to take weeks, months, days to get there, it's going to be like, this fucking sucks. I don't want to take weeks, months, days to feel better. I want to feel better now. It's a survival skill. It's a coping skill. Ultimately, addictions are a coping skill. Not always the healthiest coping skill, but a coping skill nonetheless. And it's one that, in general, works. It just comes with a lot of consequences. So, and that's where we kind of try and banish that shame, is that it is a coping skill, and it did work. Just a lot of consequences we didn't really love. Addiction is buried. There's so much shame attached to it for everyone involved. And once we start digging into that wound, it hurts even more. But let's shed some light on it. Let's make these conversations loud. Let's share our stories so society can see that there's a reason behind these, that addicts are people, that our losses are real. Important. So make sure to subscribe, keep listening. If you have an idea of something you want me to cover, or if you have a story and you want to share, again, I can do it anonymously, or you can be fully open about it. It's up to you. But if you'd like to do that, you can find me on Facebook, TikTok, or on my website at A Family Addiction. And you can submit your stories or your ideas through Facebook or the website. But tell me your story. Make it loud.